She's the most spectacular person I have ever known. Fanny Cooney never had it easy, but she learned that uses of adversity can be sweet, and it quotes her. I've always had hard times, she says, but I've always enjoyed them, and that pretty well sums up her life.
Mitsy was always special to me all through the life that I knew her. And I think it's because she made me feel special. And when I talked about her, the name Mitsy comes to mind. That's what us kids always called our grandmother. And we always want to know, where did that name come from? Nobody else's grandma was Mitsy. And it turns out that somewhere in her background, our younger days, and with her own kids growing up, someone had called her Sweetmeats. And it seemed that Mitsy is what came out of that.
But she had no fear. She went and she did it, and she commanded respect just by dint of her accomplishments and her personality as a you know, like I said, they carried around this aura of love and respect for other people, and she didn't put people down, and she didn't disrespect man or anything like that. You know, she took them for what they were, and helped to try to moderate them and, you know, make them better in a very kind and loving way.
So my grandma was a gardener. When everywhere she went, yeah, I've noticed in the photos there were pretty flowers and pretty bushes and pretty things like that, and she enjoyed it. In her art, she painted fairies resting in roses and fairies riding the autumn leaves down, and they weren't her professional fairies and flowers, because her eyesight was not as good as it once was, but they were awesome. I'd follow her around, and she was doing gardening. We'd talk about Queen Mab and what was happening in the fairy world, and I was quite sure I could see them just as well as anything. And it was a really fun. She had a very vivid imagination.
She started selling art when she was, as I remember, about 10. That she would then, you know, and folks liked her, so they would help her out. Her family was always #1 by a huge margin, and
she wasn't.
Everyone was happy around her. She wasn't a downer. She never had an excuse for anything.
And she was very modest about her fame, and after she moved to Camino Island, most people didn't even know she was famous.
If somebody else didn't explain it, she wouldn't. These things shall pass.
My grandma was Fanny young Cory, and she was born in Waukegan, Illinois in 1877. Her father was Benjamin Sayre Cory, he was slight in stature, from what I understand. He earned the living by being a salesman, and he would be off and about doing that, and the family often didn't have their needs met. My grandma's mother was Jessie McDougall, and became Jessie McDougall Cory, and she was a very nice, gentle lady who was the only of the sisters to marry in the whole family. The father kindly let her marry Benjamin Sayre, and they had 6 children. The oldest son passed away at some early, he didn't live too long. And then there was Jack, who was artistic also, and he became a political cartoonist, one of the first in New York City. And he encouraged my grandma in her art. They had that in common, for sure. Then there was Bob. My grandma later supported him in his efforts to find gold in Montana and things. And he later died of right before insulin was discovered. Agnes was her sister, who was 5 years older, and my grandma Mitsy loved Agnes just with a deep, deep love and affection. So Mitsy had a younger brother who died when he was 3, and something about him haunted her. I heard about it as a granddaughter, that he would love playing with her and would follow her around, and she would tire and try to hide from him. And then he would wander around saying, "San, San, where is you, San?" And meaning, Fan, Fan, where are you, Fan? And of course she was hiding. And she loved him very dearly and was very sad when he died and was very regretful of her bad behavior.
Her brother Bob had gone to Montana in a search for gold. He invited his 2 sisters to come and live with him.
My brother Bob, and he'd been out there before. And I was 12. I wasn't quite 13. I was a little older than 12. And I had a doll, a baby doll with me. And I hope people see me holding the doll would think me a young mother. And my brother, my husband, I played some wonderful games with myself that way. And then, as we were going across, if I wanted to see the Montana mountains, to come quick and look. And we went in the back car, and there they were, the white peaks, across this level plain, and then the white peaks. Those were my first mountains, and I've never forgotten them. They were so lovely. I've loved them ever since.
In Helena, Fan was not very interested in school. She did enjoy one class, however. That was art, taught by a kindly lady, Mary C. Wheeler. She was convinced that Fan had a great deal of talent and urged her to continue formal studies.
She didn't really want to go to school too bad, and nobody was making her, but she may have finished 8th grade. And she did have a teacher that apparently had had quite a bit of art training herself, who said that you've got a lot of talent, you should work on it. And she gave my grandma a picture that she'd made that was an oil painting, which it's still in our family now, and we always appreciate that good word that she gave to Mitsy that encouraged her to keeping on. But in her spare time, since she wasn't going to school at this point, she went to the Helena Library, and she says she read every book in the Helena Library. So she was a busy girl.
My brother and I kept house together. My sister had friends in White Sulphur Springs, and they were very fond of her, and she stayed over there one year. She was going to stay over Christmas. And she wrote and said it was very embarrassing to her. She didn't have any money to buy materials to make different little things for people for Christmas. And Bob and I didn't have any money either, but we didn't tell her that. So I had to have some money. So I wrote a a couple of little, I don't think they were poetry. I mean, I don't think they were rhymes. And sent them to Jack to see if he could get them published. And I guess he did, because he sent me $12. I said he'd sold them to a newspaper.
Mitsy got her break into art with the help of her brother, Jack, who was living in New Jersey with his wife, Bertha. And he was a political cartoonist and also had made quite a name for himself with his horse portrait paintings. He gave Mitsy $100 and offered to let her stay at his home in New Jersey and attend the Metropolitan School of Art in New York City. And she did that, and after 6 months or a year, she also was invited to become a member of the Art Students League, which is very prestigious.
I did all right. Once a week we'd have we'd all put our drawings up on a chair turned over and the drawings up here. And the professor would go around the teacher and mark them. He wouldn't mark them all. A good many of them never got a mark. And I always had a mark. A lot of those unfortunate girls never had one. And I wasn't there very long, and then I had to make a living.
After a year, young as she was, she quit art school and the Artists League and decided it was time that she needed to use her art to try to provide money, not to be a burden to her brother Jack, and also to provide for her sister, who was becoming more and more of an invalid with tuberculosis.
I walked 1,000 miles, I think, trying to sell my pictures, if that's what you mean. I went away down to the old Harper's magazine. Most of the editors, the publishers, had moved uptown, but Harper's was still downtown. And you had to go through the Bowery, and it was pretty tough then. And I was carrying some drawings under my arm to show, see if I could sell them. And I got to this old place, and it was awfully interesting. The iron stairs, so old, they were, kind of worn down in the middle. And you went up, and you went up, and you went up, and you went up to the third story. You could look down and see the front door and the entryway and halls. And up there I saw a door marked Art Editor. And I went in there, and there was a kid in a pink shirt, and he wasn't much older than I was. And I told him what I wanted, and he took my drawings and he doled them out as if they were a pack of cards like this. And then he put them together and handed them back to me. He said, of course, you realize that you have to have a reputation before you can get into Harper's. And, I was awful mad at him. But I didn't sass him. I was real ladylike. But I was talking out pretty soon and vowing that I never try to do anything for any of them. But I did. I got to doing things for Harper's Bazaar, which was run by the same company. And I knew the editor there. She was an old friend of my brother Jack's. And I had something in their magazine every number from then on, and I hope that little idiot saw it. My name would be gone. I don't know it or not. And I don't know what became of him. And I don't want to know. Wasn't a tall and nice person. But anyway, that was an experience, and that was a wonderful old place. So awfully old.
After she was turned down by the young man at Harper's Bazaar, she gathered up her portfolio and went across the hall to the Century Company. And they looked through her work and offered to pay $25 for one of her illustrations right on the spot. She became one of the leading illustrators in America, and America loved her. And more her work was on the front covers of national magazines like Life, Saturday Evening Post, St. Nicholas, Harper's Bazaar, Century, Liberty, you name them, she was there.
You know, I was so young that I'd go into a room where all the artists were waiting to go in and see an editor. And I looked kind of pathetic and being so young and kind of tired too, because I walked everywhere. I couldn't afford to drive, to take cabs and things. So I usually got in before my turn came. And I went to Scribner, and a very nice man there, and he gave me a little poem to illustrate. He didn't have anything right then, but he gave me this, and I was pretty cute, I think. I took that to show to the Century people. And they said, well, good heavens, we can't let the Scribner get ahead of us. So they gave me something to illustrate. You see, I had a business head out. And from the time I was 19, I managed to make enough to keep a home for my sister, my father, and myself. I don't know how it'd be nowadays. It'd be harder, I expect. And there's so many women. At that time, you know, there weren't very many women in that business. So that made it sort of easy. Now there's just hundreds of them. Very clever. I tried to get in to see St. Nicholas if they wanted anything of my sort. And a very nice little man named Tudor Jenks interviewed me. I was still in my teens then. I wasn't very old. And he took my drawings I wanted to show and took them in and showed them to the editor. And then I was allowed to go in and talk to the editor. And he was quite a young man, and can't remember his name now, but then I met Mary Mavis Dodge, who was the owner of St. Nicholas and the chief editor. And she was a lovely woman. She asked me to come to a lovely party she was giving for other young artists at her home in the country, which I've no doubt was a beautiful place. And I couldn't accept it. You see, at that time my sister was living, and I had to leave her alone so much that I didn't like to do anything that was unnecessary, you know, because she was always watching for me in the window when I came home, and I didn't want her to watch in vain.
And she did gradually make a pretty good income, and I believe she got that ring for Agnes. And when Agnes was getting on to 25, Mitsy was told that she was not doing well, and that probably when she passed away she would have a pulmonary big bleed. And And so Mitsy knew that. Apparently they slept together, and Mitsy felt tapping on the sheet, and Agnes was awake, and and then that's when she had her hemorrhage, and Mitsy held her in her arms. And what she said was, I held her till the light went out in her eyes. And at this point, a friend had come back and was with them, and they ran and got Jack, I believe, and went for a doctor and things. But I don't think Mitsy ever told anybody that story until one time on the farm, while I was home from my nurse's training time. We were sitting underneath a tree, and a fruit tree, and snapping beans because Mama was going to camp. And we were just sitting there, and it was just getting dusk. And for some reason, Mitsy told us all. And that's one of the precious moments and I believe, and from then on, I think she cried her heart out and didn't cry. She had other sad things that came along later, but not like she had for Agnes.
Precious memories
In 1902, Fanny moved permanently to Montana. She lived in Beaver Creek and had built a bungalow there and was doing her artwork there, and she did have some domestic help at the time. And her two brothers had set up a gold mine northeast of Helena a ways, and apparently they offered her the opportunity to be a partner in this adventure, so she was able to contribute funds to the adventure, and that kept her busy, and she was making good money at that time. Also at that time, she renewed some acquaintances that they had met when she was younger and in Montana, included a family of ranchers that lived out by Canyon Ferry, and they had several sisters, and her sister Agnes had known those, and they had several brothers. And one brother was named Fred Cooney, and apparently she mentions that he had one of the Hills family had moved in Canyon Ferry, and they had about 4 or 5 daughters. And his older brother married Emma, and he kind of liked another one. But then a school teacher moved into Canyon Ferry, and he liked her quite well, and then lo and behold, Mitsy came along, and she said, I hooked him. and so my grandma was Episcopalian by religion, and the Cooney family was Roman Catholic, having come directly from Ireland the previous generation. And so they went to the Catholic priest to ask to be married, and he said he would do it if she would raise the children to be Catholic, and she said no. And then he said he couldn't marry them, and she said to him, well, do you want us to live in sin then? And he married them. And the ranch that had been partly homesteaded by the Cooney family, that was on the Missouri River, which had been flooded to put in Canyon Ferry, had a house on it. They called it the ranch house, and that's where Fred and Mitsy were going to live. And driving out, they were driving a team, and I believe it was a wagon, and they had it loaded with their wedding presents, which had been at that year lots of cut glass dishes, and they were in the wagon. And as they got near the ranch, the horses shied and ran away. And Mitsy says, and their wedding presents were tossed out all over amongst the sagebrush, and it took quite a while to go find them all. But apparently they did, because Mitsy was able to give all of her granddaughters pieces of this cut glass china glass that she had received for wedding presents. And that's where they made their home, was on the ranch of the Cooney Ranch.
The Cooney Ranch on the east shore of Canyon Ferry Lake became home for them for nearly 50 years. Fred and helpers raised cattle and broke horses, which they trailed to Helena some 20 miles away.
In order to turn them over to the cavalry, they had to be hull-broke and ridden once. I think that was the requirement. Well, the ridden once wasn't any, you know, that whether the poor fellow had been thrown sky high, but anyway, the horse had been ridden once. And I guess it was wild that our little willows that were growing, they were planted the year I was born. So Mother used to be sitting over there drawing and so on, looking across and just see over the willows, you know, some fellow would appear. Hat would probably fly off and all this excitement around the corrals. And like Sarah said, when we got big enough to be mobile, we'd sneak over and watch some of it. But that was kind of the latter part. It was dying down. They didn't, after World War I, apparently the cavalry didn't have the need for horses that they had before.
Fanny continued producing illustrations in such books as Our Baby Book and the Fanny Cory Mother Goose. As she had drawn and painted so many babies, she now felt she should have some of her very own. After the death of the first baby, our sister Sarah appeared in the Cooney household. I came along, and then Brother Ted.
And she'd been told not to have a baby because she was small to have a baby. But she had a big concern, and one of them was her brother's gold mining operations. They had gone quite in debt, and she wanted to be sure that she didn't leave them in debt since she was a partner of this, and in a sense. And so she sat and she drew and she drew and she drew, and she didn't go for walks and she didn't do exercises particularly. She drew and did the illustrations. I believe she did make it to get her brothers out of debt, but when the time came for the baby, it had grown quite to be a big baby, and she was unable to deliver him. And so she lost that baby, and it broke her heart. It broke her health for quite a few months, maybe a year or even. On July 8th, 1907, they were able to have a little baby. It was a normal delivery, a little girl, and she was a normal weight, and her name was Agnes Sayre Cooney. But they couldn't, my grandma Mitsy couldn't call her Agnes, and she couldn't not name her Agnes. So she, all her life, went by the name of Sayre. A couple years later, 2 little boys were born to the family. They were preemies, so it was kind of nip and tuck, especially for Uncle Bob, Robert. He was named for the nurse that nursed him through, Robert Fern Cooney. He didn't like that middle name much, but why couldn't they name me with McDonald or something, McDougal? And the other one was Theodore, I think William Cooney. And so they had their 3 children and a house full of children and fun and lots of fun memories.
I think probably the worst thing that happened with a snake, and it didn't happen to be a rattlesnake thing, but one of us dashed up to the house and said there's a snake in the roof house. And this was in the late summer, so she had many, many jars of preserves and all sorts of beautiful things down there. And this snake was up on the shelves among the jars. And big snake happened to be a bull snake, which is probably a 5-footer. And he was searching for mice. And in moving along, he was pushing off jelly jars and crash. Mitsy was, this was her, she'd done so much to fix up that beautiful supply for the wintertime. She grabbed that thing by the tail, and by that time it had started to squeeze into a little crack. And I remember she kind of set her heels and she pulled. I can see that thing. Yeah, that snake must have gotten twice as long. But at last it let loose, and she tossed it out the door.
During our early years, Mother practically abandoned the place she had earned in the art world to become a full-time mother and ranch wife. She was an excellent cook, and preparing huge Sunday dinners for family and friends seemed amazingly easy for her. She carried out the many things she did in a quiet, orderly way, probably the reason she accomplished so much. We always thought of her as an especially happy person. She kept very much to herself the sadnesses that had crossed her early life. Mother seemed always ready to undertake anything that needed doing.
So the ranch was not the most profitable venture in the world. It provided a living, but now the children, their 3 children were growing up and going off to college, and there were real needs for that, and she had very high aspirations for her kids. And so she was racking her mind how to get back into art, because the door that had opened so beautifully to her when she was young and one of the first women illustrators, now there were a lot of women illustrators, and it wasn't the same anymore. And her brother encouraged her to try comics, and her brother Jack, and so she tried, and she did a couple kind of tentative ones about a young family and the kids in it, and it was it drew the attention of King Feature Syndicate, and they asked her to take one of the little people in that series and to make a comic about him. And so she did. Every day there was a single little, it's kind of like Family Circus is. This little boy, Sonny, who had a little sister and a mom and a dad and a grandpa, and he was always, I don't know if he was 5 at the beginning, but he never got any older. And she did that for decades. And she had to think of the joke. There was always a smile behind it all, and he talked in baby language, and she, from her own background, and then other people got to sending her great ideas from their own kids, and she turned them into this magic of this entertaining, wonderful little family and the little boy that was so precocious. Later, King Feature Syndicate, and this was carried nationally in papers all across America. Both of these, there was a strip she added to it named Little Miss Muffet, and it was King Feature's answer to the very, very popular Little Orphan Annie comic strip. And so she did, another lady wrote that at the beginning, but sometimes she didn't write in time. My grandma needed to have the strip, the words, so she'd know how to do the art. And eventually, my grandma did both, the writing of that and the daily strip that was long.
Mother felt that her daughter, Sarah, had a great deal of latent talent. She sent her to the Philadelphia School of Art, but Sarah soon decided she didn't care to pursue an art career. She became a nurse. Ted became a doctor, and I followed a long career with the Montana Fish and Game Department. Little Sonny had helped so much with all those years of tuition.
The ranch, it was a dream to all of us. Daddy would say as we got into Montana that we just left God's country. He always would kind of tease him about it. But Mother was just ecstatic from the minute we hit the Rockies, you know. And then coming in, we'd go down the big hill, and then we'd go down the little hill. There were cattle guards across on each one of them and fences. And then after you cross the little, got down from the little hill, then this cattle guard, and then you'd come in by the ranch and drive around, and Mitsy and Popsy would come out. Mitsy would always come out, do we live? And Popsy would be there. And it was almost, it was like, you know, next to heaven.
She made our visits there so fun. You know, she was always happy and enthused about everything, and she made sure that there were a lot of activities for the kids, and they could I mean, sometimes we would go searching for Indian arrowhead. She had a rowboat, and I think it was called the No Wonder.
When I was out there in the summer with Ted, she instigated a table manners contest. And in this contest, it was mainly between me and Ted because we were both just kind of heathen at the dinner table. And she wanted us to learn how to use the fork and spoon nice, to cut nice, to elevate it up to the, to drink and no slurping, and stuff like that. So the contest was that whoever shaped up the best was going to, and they had to, be above a certain level because she wouldn't even think about taking us over there if we weren't up to a pretty high standard. But whoever shaped up the best was going to go with her to the Montana Club. And this was quite an elegant thing. It didn't get me too excited, but it's just something to do and something where to be sitting around with her as kind of a hero. And I don't know how much effort I made, but I was lucky. My cousin, he was a kind of a, screw up type of guy where he just got his fun, getting a rise out of people. So he wouldn't cooperate too well. And so my pretty well going along to get along there won me the award. And so I went to the Montana Club with her, and all these sophisticated high-class ranchers with a tie on or whatever, they were coming in there. They all knew Mitsy, and I was, kind of a prince bud there for a while.
During these years, Mother had found moments to indulge in her love for beauty in the creation of a series of watercolors. She called them a fairy alphabet. These scenes were done in the soft colors she always favored and included dainty fairies and imaginary creatures surrounded by flowers, birds, and butterflies, and small animals.
So my grandpa died. His heart just got worse and worse, and my mother was pregnant with me, and it was toward the end of her time, and my dad didn't want her going to see him, so she didn't. And he did die. And so that's when Grandpa I never saw. But my grandma stayed there for a while, and during that time, after he had passed away, she became Mother of the Year in 1951 for the state of Montana, and went back to New York and was dined and honored, and we were all very proud of her.
A profound change in her life came about in 1953 when the large Canyon Ferry Dam flooded most of what was left of the old ranch.
Uncle Bob said that he and Mitsy thought they would observe while the flood was going on, so they came up on the bench and they actually watched it, and he said that they both wished they hadn't. And it ended up everything being under about 70 feet of water, and the last thing they could see were the tops of the willows.
My personal family moved to Camino Island in 1947, and I was I don't even know if I was quite one. And we lived on a farm and enjoyed Camino very much. And my dad was a doctor. He'd travel 16 miles to Stanwood, back and forth every day. And my grandma decided a lovely little cabin came up for sale near us, and so she purchased that. And she didn't live in it year-round until 1952. But in my little mind, I always had a grandma nearby, and it was I shouldn't say this, but my favorite grandma. And we had access to her, and walking, we could walk. There weren't very many kids to play with, there, in fact, hardly any on the whole south end of Camino. And so my grandma and my mom became my great playmates, and I loved spending time with her.
We could run down the road, down her driveway, and run to her house. She always was happy to see us. In the early days, she always had bread baked. And if we had to do our chores and get in hay, or if we went swimming on a real hot day, we could go to Mitsy's, and she would have cold watermelon. And to us, watermelon was an expensive, very special treat, and we just loved it. We would come over in the evenings, and she would read a book. She read lots of books to us, actually. My favorite one that's made the biggest impression on my life was David Copperfield, with the whole book unabridged. So for us kids, it was a huge treat to have Mitsy.
So as I grew up, my grandma purposed in her heart to do a little watercolor out of the paper that she used for her long comic strips. She just cut it and would do a picture every day of where she was. And you wouldn't think she'd find that much to paint, but yeah, she did. And there were the different seasons, there were the different weather conditions. Out her window, there's hundreds of wonderful pictures: sunrise, sunset, misty, snowy, sunny. It's all fascinating. And then when we came over, she always had extra paper and extra everything. And my mom had gone to art school, and she was a wonderful artist and could paint or draw anything she ever saw. And then here us kids were, and so it was a natural thing that we were invited to paint. They developed a club to make it fun, and they called it the Grunt and Groan Art Club. And Grunt and Groan is a really odd name for an art club, but that was because we would all be there bent over our efforts and didn't have time to really talk. So we just look over and see someone else's art and say, or something. And so that was such a common happening that's where the name Grunt and Groan Club came.
She had a lot of humor and a lot of wit going on. And her and Dad used to get into it, you know. Dad liked to, you know, kind of tease around, and but he always, when it came to voting time, he was always complaining, and you know, she'd come right back at him, but about him taking her over to the poll and canceling his vote out. So she never talked to me about God per se, except she always was talking about love. And, you know, and she tied that in with God. And God, you know, he admits that God is love. He gets it out in the Bible. But that's the most powerful element in the world. And she exuded it, and she lived it. She was something that you could really look up to. It's like you know you come from royalty. And you know that you can be creative, and it's like you're given a license to create, and if, in fact, almost a hunger and a wanting to join in and be part of it, and to do something worthwhile, something that can be giving forth beauty or music or love more, expressed in whatever ways. You know, she kind of set a high mark. It was a touchstone. It was like Reagan had the shiny city on the hill, we had the Queen of Montana Beach, and the kind of in lights over there that we looked to.
When I was 16, we left the farm. My dad bought a house in Stanwood so he wouldn't have to go so far on house calls. In those days, he was the only doctor in his practice, and he went when somebody called. And so we left our dear Mitsy, and we went to town. And anyway, to me, my home was the farm. And Mitsy was one of the main parts of my life. And so we would see her on Sundays and go to church or something, always stop and visit, but it was never the same. And occasionally I would stay overnight with her, come ride the school bus out, and that was always fun. And I observed her. She had routine. She went to bed at 10 and up at 6. And before she went to bed, she would lie on the floor on her back and do sit-ups. And I'm talking now, she was, probably 80, in her 80s. And, but she did it, and she also read to herself every night a chapter out of the Bible. And she also kissed this little tiny oval picture of her sister Agnes every night. And her home was always hospitable, and I was always welcome. And so was the rest of our family and other people. And one of the things about her was I never heard her complain. I never heard her feel sorry for herself. I never heard anything. She had a great sense of humor and was so much fun to be around, but if there was a joke, it was always on herself. And she was a good storyteller, and the jokes on her were pretty funny. And so eventually, she got older and older, and she was living by herself. And neighbors came and brought her mail and looked in on her, and were very grateful to them. And then one time, she'd left a pot on the stove, and it started a fire in the cabinets above her stove, a little fire, and I didn't know how that got put out. And then another time she was not responsive, and she came, somebody, must have been the neighbors, discovered this, and she came into town in an ambulance. And she would say her deep regret about that was that she'd always wanted to ride in an ambulance and have the lights going and the siren and get in on all of that. And here, when she actually did it, she was not enjoying the ride. So she came to live in our family's home from then on in Stanwood, and had her own room and bedroom. And her eyesight was failing, and she wasn't as steady on her feet, and ended up finding a wheelchair. And that was part of our lives for maybe 4 years. And then she, at her final illness, when she passed away, it wasn't really an illness. My dad said if she would try to live as hard as she was trying to die, she'd get better. But she didn't get better because she was 94 and she couldn't see well. She had cataracts, and they didn't have the miracle way they have of repairing that they do today. And she was hard of hearing, and my mom was gone some of the day helping my dad, and she was lonely, which is sad for me. And so she, I guess, just kind of decided it was time for her to go. And she quit eating and drinking, basically, and they took care of her. My dad was a doctor, and my mom a nurse. And they loved her and took great care of her, but she lived longer than I ever dreamed a person could live without much food and without much liquid. And I kept thinking, oh my goodness, it's just dragging on, it's so awful. And I wouldn't go down always to see her. And that's something I regret, because during that time, she was in and out of consciousness, and like sometimes when they tried to move her to get her comfortable, she would swear and all kinds of things, be a little mad. And I didn't want her mad at me, so I would just ask my mom, how is she? And then one time after our second child, April, was born, and I was alone in the house with her and with April, and probably Jason was napping. But I went in and I thought, I'll just sit by her. I thought she was probably, it's not unconscious, but it's in a unresponsive kind of state. And I sat by her and talked to her some, and she knew who I was. It was the most precious time I could ever dream of having. And she didn't talk that much, but we held hands, and she held the baby's hand. And it was just one of my very most wonderful memories. And I thought, here she is, this wonderful, wonderful grandma, my talented, beautiful artist grandma. And here I have this little baby that doesn't know her, doesn't know anything at that time, but it was like I was the middle person. And somehow I was entrusted to bring those two parts together and to keep that legacy going.
Your painting hanging on the wall tells a vivid story. My mind can see with fresh new eyes glimpses of glory. I wish that I could be like you and see the inner beauty. But for now, I'll just say wow, and thanks for Fanny, Cory. You saw the good, not the bad. You helped us laugh, not be sad. You poked fun at the things of life and showed us joy instead of strife. Your painting hanging on the wall tells a vivid story. My mind can see with fresh new eyes glimpses of glory. I wish that I could be like you and see the inner beauty. But for now, I'll just say wow, and thanks for Fanny, Cory. See inside our heart, the gift of beauty was your art. You showed us what we could not see and helped us dream our minds set free. Your painting hanging on the wall tells a vivid story. My mind can see with fresh new eyes glimpses of glory. I wish that I could be like you and see the inner beauty. But for now, I'll just say wow, and thanks for Fanny, Cory. But for now, I'll just